What is a soul? Do you have a soul? Are you a soul? Throughout history, most cultures have accepted the notion of a spiritual essence said to transcend death. Its presumed existence offers hope to the forlorn and comfort to the bereaved. But most scientists, given the remarkable advances in understanding the biology of the brain, are materialists. They believe that only the physical is real. Materialists reject dualism, denying the existence of an independent, non-physical soul. Next, on Closer to Truth, can science seek the soul? Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm Robert Kuhn. History records ancient and continuing battles between science and spirit, forever destined, it seems, to be on opposite sides of a great divide. Could be dangerous to get into this one. To hear from all sides, we invited 5 soul-savvy experts. Dr. Charles Tart, a pioneer in parapsychology, is professor at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in San Francisco. Dr. Fred Alan Wolfe is a physicist who writes on consciousness and the new physics. Dr. Warren Brown is professor of psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. Dr. John Searle, a leading philosopher of mind, is professor at the University of California at Berkeley. And Dr. Dean Radin is an experimental psychologist who studies extrasensory perception, ESP. Charles, your recent book, Body, Mind, and Spirit, propounds the importance of spirituality. What's the relationship between the existence of the soul, if it exists, and spirituality?
Well, spirituality is predicated on the idea that this is more than just a short-term show here with nothing to show after we die, that there are long-term consequences, and that has enormous effects on how people live their life, whether they believe that or not. I don't think we should just believe it or not believe it. I think we should look at the evidence that there is something that might transcend death, that transcends the physical body. And I find there's some evidence for that, which makes spirituality much more interesting to me than if it was just a belief.
And will that directly affect our lives if that's true?
I think it'll affect your lives a lot. Suppose you know you're going to die in a short while. What are you going to do with your last hours?
I'm going to have 2 shows like this.
Do you think that's a good investment for the long term?
I think it is.
I think it is too, actually, in that particular
case. Good, or else
case.
you'd be off the show.
Yeah.
Fred, your book, The Spiritual Universe, claims to be able to use scientific methods to prove that the soul exists. But how can you use physical, scientific methods to prove the existence of something that's not physical?
Well, first of all, we have to define what we mean by a soul. If we can get a definition which meets some kind of scientific test of provability, then we could prove its existence. I think we already have enough groundwork to start the search. I believe that there's enough in the nature of the way the physical universe is constructed to indicate the presence of something called soul. Now, where I begin looking for this is in the nature of quantum mechanics or quantum physics, which says that there may be a spiritual underpinning to all the physical world.
Warren, you are a neuroscientist, a neuropsychologist, and a committed Christian. Your recent book is What Happened to the Soul. Tell us, what happened?
Well, the position we take in the book is that the idea of a soul as a separate metaphysical entity isn't necessary to explain humankind. That doesn't mean that God doesn't exist and there isn't a spiritual world, but you don't have to add an element to humankind, to the physicalness of our humanness, in order to explain and to account for what it means to be human.
This is not necessarily Christian orthodoxy.
No, probably most Christians would find this a tough road.
Well,
but this is what I would call non-essential theology. That is, it's not a critical point for most Christian theology.
John, you've been a leader to rediscover the mind, the title of one of your many books. Does rediscovering the mind mean defending the existence of a soul?
Depends on what you mean by the soul. There are different definitions of this, and I don't find the notion of a soul much use because of this confusion. There is Aristotle's notion of the soul, which is kind of a principle of organization of the body, and I got no objection to that. And if by soul you just mean mind, I'm all for it. But there's another definition of soul, which we got from Descartes and dualists and so on, that says there's this thing attached to your body, and when your brain and your body are destroyed, the thing is going to cut loose and have a life of its own. Now, that's very comforting to believe, but I never saw any evidence for that. All the experiences I ever had were caused by processes in my brain, and it's kind of depressing, but it turns out, as far as I can tell, when my brain goes, those experiences go. I'm not going to have any soul after the destruction of my brain any more than I'm going to have digestion after my stomach is destroyed.
Dean, your book, The Conscious Universe, claims to apply scientific methods to the investigation of paranormal or psi phenomena. Can the same kinds of methodologies be used to approach the soul?
I think the same kind of methodologies can and actually have been applied to look for after-death type phenomena. But you would think that as a parapsychologist, I would be highly sympathetic to the existence of soul through the empirical methods, but actually I'm fairly doubtful that so far we have any good evidence for something like soul, something which actually survives bodily death.
Well, the early days of parapsychology, your field, of course, survival research, investigations of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, and people coming back to talk through mediums and seances was a major part of the field. That apparently is no longer the case. Why is that?
It's true. Parapsychology started pretty much as a study of mediumistic phenomena. But within a matter of a decade or less, it transitioned into laboratory studies of things like telepathy between the medium and the supposed departed loved one. And the reason that it transitioned is because in the first case, you need to know whether something like telepathy might be real. And if it is, it suddenly casts enormous doubt on what a medium says that he or she is actually communicating with.
So survival research in its technical sense has become less important to this question.
No, I think it's still very important. It's just that it turns out to be extremely difficult to find a valid empirical way of testing that with excluding the possibility of psi.
Warren, tell us how you've approached the soul from a scientific point of view. You run a neurophysiological lab. You're interested in brain damage. You deal with the rudiments of mind and brain, and you have obviously a very strong commitment to the received Christian tradition, the Old and New Testaments. So tell us how you can bring this together in a scientific search for the soul.
Well, one thing you know in neuropsychology is that brain damage or brain malfunction creates and changes states of consciousness, awareness, and in a number of situations changes people's understanding of their spirituality. For example, an easy one to look at is temporal lobe epilepsy. A person can have, in some circumstances, an experience which seems quite religious. And I really think that these experiences are in fact embodied in our physical beings, that you don't need to postulate a soul. For this project to stand within Christian theology, you do have to agree or to postulate that God exists, that God is spiritual, and that our spirituality represents our ability to be in relationship to God who is spirit. But it is not necessary to postulate that we in fact have a spirit as another entity which determines our